Good morning. I hope you had your coffee today because we are going to be talking about caffeine. Now, 75% of the caffeine ingested in the United States comes from coffee alone, and that's not including additional energy drinks and beverages or even prescription medications. Now, your standard 12-ounce drip coffee has about 150 milligrams of caffeine inside of it, whereas an energy drink on average has 100 milligrams of caffeine. Those both are well below the limit given by the FDA of 400 milligrams per day of caffeine. Now, this psychoactive drug that keeps our university going has a fairly simple structure shown right here. It has a few functional groups that I want to draw attention to. So right here we have an amide, we have some amines, and then we also have some methyl groups as well. And these functional groups together contribute to the lipophilic or fat-loving and the hydrophilic or water-loving characteristics of this molecule. Now later on we're going to discuss why these are relevant to the metabolism of caffeine, but first we want to talk about what caffeine does inside of the body.
All right, guys, so now we're going to discuss a little more on how caffeine actually affects the body by looking at the binding nature of caffeine. So when you feel sleepy, it is because of molecules called adenosine floating around in your brain. Adenosine is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, and we'll just shorten neurotransmitter to NT, meaning that it can act as a central nervous system depressant. It binds to the adenosine receptors on neurons and facilitates the slowdown of our brain's signaling functions, inducing a sensation we term drowsiness. Adenosine concentration is highest in the brain when you have expended a lot of ATP, which is your body's energy currency. So it makes sense that you feel tired after working all day or running a marathon. Now let's bring caffeine into the equation. The key to caffeine's stimulating capabilities lies in its chemical structure, which is very similar to that of adenosine. Let's take a look. Here I have drawn adenosine, and here I've drawn caffeine. As you can see, to a nerve cell, the two compounds are virtually indistinguishable, and thus will allow either caffeine or adenosine to bind to the adenosine receptors. As we learned earlier this quarter, this is called competitive inhibition. Because the caffeine is inhibiting the effects of adenosine by competing for its binding sites. The greater the caffeine to adenosine ratio, the more spaces caffeine will occupy, and the larger the impact of that afternoon espresso will be. However, when caffeine occupies the binding sites on nerve cells, it does not precipitate the slowdown that adenosine does when it binds to the nerve. Instead of slowing down, the cells speed up and fire their signals rapidly.
So somehow, caffeine has to make it to the brain. So let's talk about metabolism. Now, this process generally begins with ingestion of the caffeine molecule. So whether that's a cup of coffee, where we absorb the caffeine through our digestive system, or caffeine can also be absorbed through mucous membranes. Now, once inside of the digestive system, caffeine will rapidly enter the bloodstream, with about 99% of the molecule being absorbed within only 45 minutes of ingestion. So let's take a look at the structure of caffeine once more. So seen here, these carbonyl molecules of caffeine are going to contribute to the water-loving or hydrophilic characteristic of caffeine. And this means that caffeine will easily cooperate with water and pass through interstitial fluids with ease. Another characteristic of caffeine is that it's lipophilic. These methine groups in the molecule will contribute to its both hydrophobic and fat-loving characteristic, allowing it to pass easily through fat membranes. And you might ask, why would we even care about that? Well, the biggest membrane that we're concerned with in terms of caffeine is that it can easily pass through the blood-brain barrier, causing caffeine to have a big effect on the central nervous system.
So finally, the compound makes its way to the liver, which is actually the major processing center for caffeine and accounts for about 80% of caffeine metabolism. So once in the liver, it's broken down to these three major metabolites, which I've illustrated here. Paraxanthine is the most major one and accounts for about 84% of breakdown. Theobromine is the next major and contributes about 12% of the breakdown. And theophylline is pretty minor and is only about 4% of that caffeine molecule breakdown. So all of these molecules have their own physiological effects. Paraxanthine actually being the most notable, as it's very similar to caffeine, both in structure and its effects on the body. It's actually also a competitive inhibitor for adenosine, so it's going to have some of those same slowed speeding up effects that caffeine does. So once all these compounds have exited the liver, they're going to be processed by the kidneys, and then excreted in the urine. So about 97% of excretion is due to metabolites, and only about 3% is excreted as the regular caffeine molecule. And this suggests that caffeine is actually very readily metabolized by our body, which makes us happy because then we can absorb it and have all those effects that we really love. So here you are, you're happy with your cup of coffee because you can absorb it. So the normal half-life of caffeine in the body is about 5 hours, and that's for a normal human adult. So some factors that we know of that can affect that metabolism rate are smoking. So here you have your cigarette, and that's going to increase your rate of caffeine metabolism and lower that half-life. And then contraceptives is another interesting thing, and that's going to actually nearly double the half-life of caffeine in women taking oral contraceptives. So that's going to be decreasing your caffeine metabolism. So now we're just going to talk a little bit about the physiological effects that caffeine actually has on your body.
Okay, for those of you that have taken advantage of the coffee provided, soon your pituitary gland will sense an increase in firing of your neuron cells, shown here. The pituitary gland senses this as an emergency situation, similar to the reaction your brain goes through when you become frightened. This causes a release of two hormones known as epinephrine and norepinephrine. These two hormones are responsible for stimulating our fight or flight response, which is derived from our sympathetic nervous system. As a result, you will experience an increase in heart rate, an increase in respiratory rate, as well as vasoconstriction, and also pupil dilation. Caffeine has both positive and negative effects on the human body. First, you can experience heartburn due to the acid buildup in the stomach, an inhibition of calcium uptake, which leads to osteoporosis, an increase in urination due to the diuretic effect caffeine has, and in an overdose, caffeine can actually cause confusion and hallucinations. Caffeine also causes premature ventricular contractions, known as PVCs, in your heart. These are extra beats of your ventricles. But of course, most of us take the caffeine coffee for the positive effects it has on the central nervous system. Caffeine can help us feel more alert, which is why it is a common ingredient in the medication which treats drowsiness. In summary, caffeine is a central nervous system stimulant that increases alertness, decreases reaction time, but don't drink more than 75 cups of coffee because you'll most likely die.